it was never the plan for you to be president, but somehow you landed up becoming president. When you look back, what do you think was the hardest part of the job, or the hardest part of being SUS president?
I think the hardest part was really keeping everything together, like and
Hmm.
everyone together. That's where I really learned a lot, actually. Initially going in, the day I won, my first reaction was I was hanging out in Rohtas's dhaba, trying to get his recipe for the samosa, by the way, because that was his. I was just waiting, and there was nothing to do, and he was
Yeah.
in a particularly chatty mood, so he showed me all these old record books, and he was talking about his recipes, and suddenly I saw this wave of people coming in, and my first reaction was, okay, if we won, oh no, like what do I do now, right?
Hmm.
And so I was worried about really the work and how things will go. But because I had such incredible people working with me, pretty much the whole college, it was amazing how things really worked out.
Hmm.
So that's not what ended up being the reason that I got worried, or that wasn't
Hmm.
the hardest part actually.
Hmm.
As I expected, it was really keeping the factions, the various sort of interests and various aspirations together.
Hmm.
And I think that took a lot more, and that was the least enjoyable part as well. I think the real
Hmm.
politicking part of it, also, I had still, any reason you lapse, there were a lot of people to still kind of latch onto that.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
there was this whole kind of public opinion aspect as well.
Hmm.
So these are the things that I actually worried about. Although I don't think they were really that real
Hmm.
outside of my head, probably. But that was not
Hmm.
enjoyable as much, I think.
Hmm. Now, sort of when you look back, like almost a decade, were there things that you learned during that 1 year that you apply in life, or you apply to life? Because you've not been in quote unquote politics ever since, but are there things that you learned in that year that you found yourself going back to once you graduated?
I think the first thing I learned was that, well, this is not what I want to do. I think,
Well, important.
yeah, it's a process of elimination. I did realize that, yes, there are aspects of it which I could be good at. So things that like working with people,
Hmm.
being able to be articulate about certain things in a way. Those are kind of skills or lessons that really, yeah, stayed with me. Also, I think what I learned during that time was also to judge people's character more different, not judge as in terms of a judgment, but especially, like the day that shift happens,
Hmm.
that I become the president, suddenly your relationship with everybody changes a lot.
Hmm.
And here I'm thankful to my closest friends and my, who, including yourself, who were all people who supported me for the person I am and looking after me as the person, not
Hmm.
not as the institution or the sort of, yeah, the office that I represent.
Hmm.
But for a lot of other people, that becomes a reason for then your relationship to happen, right, in a particular
Hmm.
way. So I realized also to read people, it's a different kind of skill. And I think that
Hmm.
also stayed with me a little bit. Not that I particularly used it efficiently in my life and career, but I think that overall, yeah, I learned about people. Um,
Hmm.
and I think that's something that has been useful for me.
Hmm. So basically, people like behaved with you in a certain way, not because it was you, just because you were president, and that was
Yes,
like figuring it
yes,
out was hard.
yes. Hard sometimes, but yeah, often it was also clear that,
Hmm.
and even if it's a person who you are otherwise friendly with or have good relations with, but the
Yeah.
thing is that once there is a question of give and take, or
Yeah.
something of that sort, like a transactional aspect to that relationship,
Hmm.
that comes out a bit more to the fore, and
Yeah.
and you can see that clearly, more clearly
Yeah.
than I was before when I there were no stakes attached.
Yeah. Yeah. That is a hard one. Okay, so maybe for people who are listening, a quick recap of what Kakati, and I will refer to Aditya as Kakati because that's how I've been referring to him over the last decade, I think, has been up to over the last 10 years. So, me and Kakati crossed paths in 2010. It was my first year in university, and it was Kakati's last. The year he walked in with all these rumors of him going to become president. Of course, he eventually became president of the union, the Student Union Society, but Kakri studied history in Stephens. This was from 28 to 20, no, 2009 to
8,
2000, 2008 to
11.
2011.
I think 11 I graduated. Yes.
Yes, you graduated in 11. After history, you went to Geneva. You were one of the first, I would say, waves of people to land up in Geneva, and Kakari proudly says that he is the reason it became popular, or one of the many reasons it became popular among the masses that followed. You went there to study, do a master's in international history. You then hung out in Europe. You went to do your PhD, and then you went to do two postdocs post that, and broadly in the Netherlands. And you are now going to start a teaching gig also in the Netherlands. So, ladies and gentlemen, a decade in academia, I don't think I would have survived, but we will figure out how he did through the next hour or so we chat about. But maybe a good place to start. We talked a lot about you becoming president, but leaving all of that aside, what was your favorite memory from your time in college?
Oh, that's a tough one. There are too many probably, so I might have to pass on that.
What is the
But
first one which comes to mind
first
when you
one,
look back at those years from 2008 to 2011?
I
It's
would need a
almost
moment.
12, 13 years ago now.
Well, I think I wouldn't say maybe a single memory, but I think the times we spent, hanging out in the evening, going for dinner together, whether in the mess or somewhere else, our little expeditions to various parts, and those days Majnu Ka Tila was also not very popular as
Mm,
it is now. So we used to go
yeah.
when it was still very dingy,
Mm,
and we still had good food, right? So
yeah.
those kind of things are what I really hold dear, and also something that I didn't think very consciously about, but the fact that just living in residence is something um, that has, I don't know, for some has had a very formative impact on me. The kind of
Mm,
people I met, interactions, even the space itself. And oddly enough, and I've never had this for any other place I've lived in. I've lived in so many places and countries and sort of locations, but I I occasionally dream about the college, the room I stayed in. Like it appears in my dreams, right? Like so, I don't know what to make of that.
mm,
Why that has had that habitat has had that kind of lasting impact on me. I don't know, but
mm.
it's there. So,
I do remember when you were clearing up your room, what a mess it was.
yeah,
But you were in the same room for like 3 years or 2 years?
2 years, yeah, and
Two
yeah,
years.
it was a
Mukesh
very
extension.
yeah. Now it's been actually cordoned off, right? Last time I was
Yes.
there, I saw that after 10 p.m., all the boys are also locked in.
Yeah. That
So
is pretty insane.
very progressive.
Mm.
Um,
Okay. So that was your favorite memory from your time in college. Maybe let's talk about Geneva. You were the first, I would say, set of people to go to Geneva. Of course, it was, I think, on scholarship, so no brainer. But I mean, you've been in academia since you graduated, and I'm curious to know like what has kept you in academia ever since. So maybe if you dial back, when you were coming to college to study history, was that always the plan? Like, did you know that I'm going to do a bachelor's in history, then I will go do a master's, then I will go do a PhD? Like, was that part of your plan when you came into college 2008, or it was just like I'll just take one step at a time and figure where it goes? Like, was it a conscious decision that you would do Geneva after college, or it was like, oh, this seems cool, it's free, let's do it?
it's more of the latter, really. I mean,
Yeah.
I was winging it then, and I still am, I think.
Mm.
So I had no clear plan. My I had very low ambitions as well. I was going to be happy doing like a low-lying masters in the EU, kind of
Mm.
living in the same environment, till this Geneva thing came up. Although I did apply for it because somebody from there, who eventually was he was also a PhD student of the same supervisor I had, and
Mhm.
he comes to Stephen's to sort of talk about the place. The problem was he was only coming to Stephens, and that's where it changed to the masses because I kind of helped him re-strategize his whole plan. I said, "Why are you
Mm.
going to Stephens to market the place? I mean,
Mm.
you'll have one student probably who'll come on a scholarship. You're not never going to make any money there." Uh,
Yeah.
so he listened to me, and then they changed their marketing a little bit,
Mm.
which helped sort of the mass exodus from TU afterwards.
Mm.
Um, but I think, yeah, going in, I had no clear plan. I had two options. I had this offer in Geneva, or I had three, let's
Mm.
say. I had this offer in Osaka in Japan, like that was an exchange we used to have
Mhm.
from the college, but it's not a degree, it's just an exchange. And the third
Mhm.
option was to do a MA in DU. Um,
Mm.
and so when I went for the master's, it was just out of curiosity. I really
Mm.
wanted, they were offering courses that we don't have, like
Mm.
more contemporary history and so on, and academia was not part of the plan. It still isn't somehow. I think in my own mind, I am still not a complete academic in the usual sense of the term. Like who goes checking each box as you should if you wanted to be an
Mm.
academic. Uh,
Really? Why? You've done a master's, you've done a PhD, you've done like postdocs. Like, what is left to call yourself an academic?
so it's just how I see what an academic does, right? Like I think that yes, it has. I stayed in it. Because you asked me why I have been in it, it was mobility. Like when I went to Geneva, I come from Guwahati, which is now a
Hmm.
fairly big city. When I was growing up, it wasn't. Yeah, it was okay, but it wasn't. You didn't get the most exposure there, right? So
Yeah.
coming to Delhi, coming to Stephens was a big, somewhat of a big culture shock actually,
Yeah.
and that was the time when I got exposure to India, largely speaking.
Hmm.
Stephens being kind of a microcosm, let's say. So going to
Hmm.
Geneva opened up a whole new world of possibility, and also Geneva being how it is, it opened up the
Hmm.
globe, right? Like it didn't open up a nation state. I didn't go to the US and encounter America,
Hmm.
for example, or the UK, which was the usual track for a lot of people who had serious academic ambitions, wanted to go to Oxbridge, and then they would go to the US for a
Hmm.
PhD. So that's the usual route. Um, I wasn't particularly keen on that. I just went with what I had and what it allowed me to do, which was have access to a different sense of being in the world, right? Um,
Hmm.
and that's why I continued being in Geneva. Like I continued doing my PhD there because I had a good relationship with my supervisor. I wanted to learn under him or with him because
Hmm.
he pushed me to do things that I didn't know I wanted to do, right? So
Hmm.
or I didn't know that I could do, basically like food research, which is
Hmm.
something that had been a part of my time in college as well. I was doing my projects on these kind of historical food um, courses,
Hmm.
projects, things I could write. So yeah, so in a way that allowed me to foster that identity. I am still an academic, but I am one. I won't deny that. But
Hmm.
I'm not only an academic. I think, or I don't think like the average academic or the usual academic, because
Hmm.
I also have this interest in working with people, working outside of just my own little academic venture. So I think intellectual
Hmm.
growth is a different project. They go together, but intellectual growth is one side of it, which every academic experiences. But the other side of it
Hmm.
is that how do I see myself being part of a larger productive thing. So that teaching can be one of those things, but it
Hmm.
need not be. So even now, given how academic jobs are and the job market is, I'm not disinclined to think that, okay, tomorrow if I need to do something else, using the same set of skills I have got
Yeah.
now or learned in the last 10, like it's been more than that, actually, like 10 to 12 years, uh, how can I bring that to something which I find fulfilling myself?
Hmm. And what would that look like? Say it was not quote unquote academia, and you touched a little bit upon teaching, but what does that look like?
I think
Not being an academic.
not being academic in the fullest sense of the term, here I think, you know, when one can work with, for example, capacity building as a consultant, right? So
Hmm.
that's not something I have done, but it's something where I can bring all this exposure. Let's say if I were to do it in India
Hmm.
or even in Northeast India, where a lot of my work is based,
Hmm.
then it would bring a lot of the exposure and the skills and all the other things that I have gained. Um, there's an opportunity to bring it elsewhere, right? And I
Hmm.
think that's one area of doing that. I mean, research itself is important, of course, but see, the research I feel that is mostly for my own interest, right? It may serve
Hmm.
the process of knowledge um, more broadly, but I think that being able to somehow bring these beyond the conventional readership of academic readership, being able to bring important ideas and issues into a more public realm, these are ways in which it can be done. Now,
Hmm.
I haven't really figured out what are the exact routes for this.
Hmm.
Uh, and of course, if all of this fails, I'm happy to also just try. Um, I mean, it's a different kind of job, but like as a hobby, I'm keen to also cook,
Hmm.
and that's also another way of sharing knowledge, sharing experiences. So I think there are ways to bring that aspect as well. It's also interactive with people, so it can be sort of, I wouldn't say a career option, but like yeah, it's kind of fallback, let's
Hmm.
say, um, if the other things are not attractive anymore.
Hmm. I mean, I'm sure they will work out. They have not worked out. But I think the reason I ask these questions is that a lot of people probably maybe a few years, 3, 4, 5 years behind, who are on this path of doing a PhD. Maybe they're in the middle of it. A lot of people who've been on this podcast are, somewhere in the middle of their journey of that PhD. And yeah, I think it's just good to hear from people who are a few years down the line on where they are and how they think about the future. Um, I've heard from a lot of people that PhD is a very very lonely experience. Was that the same for you, or how would you describe like the highlights or maybe the lowlights of doing the PhD or even maybe doing the postdocs?
I think it's more than loneliness, it's an isolating process. So you may not be lonely.
Hmm.
Uh, Very likely you will be as well because it involves moving around necessarily, or it involves moving away from your family, your partner, all kinds of things, right? But I think it's
Hmm.
isolating both in a intellectual way, but also in a social way. And
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean that it's not worth it. I think that is part of that, right? Like that is part of the journey that's supposed to be. Like a PhD is totally pointless if you already knew the outcome of what you're going to be doing and you pretty much did that, right? So then it's not really a research process. It's really a journey that of self growth, self discovery. You learn your limits. You learn what you're good at, what you're not, and where you need to improve. But that's just from a skill set point of view, but not only, right? Like that's in every aspect of your life. So I think it does change you. So those who are doing PhDs, I would, yeah, like I have full power to them. It's I think it's a process one should do, and one should do it enjoyably. I think that's the important part. Like don't do it for the heck of it. Which
Hmm.
is kind of what I did, but not really for the heck of it, right? Like it was really for the
Hmm.
journey. I didn't care so much for the outcome at that point when I was doing it because it gave me a certain kind of mobility, both
Hmm.
intellectual and physical mobility. And that's the part I
Hmm.
enjoyed a lot. Just getting to travel in a certain way, getting to meet more people in a very different way that I would not have had I not been doing this sort of research. And
Hmm.
so yeah, so that's something I would say. But one thing,
Hmm.
especially today, at the state that academia is in, when it comes to being employed after you do a PhD, my word of caution would be to actually have a little bit of clarity as to why you're going in to do the PhD,
Hmm.
because that will help, to understand that okay, I want to be an academic, or maybe I also have other options open. Like we should not think of it because there was a time that if you did a PhD, basically it was really almost given that you were going to do that as an academic venture. Uh,
Hmm.
and especially so in the US, where the universities are designed like that. It's like PhD producing, academics producing factories. Uh,
Hmm.
but does it make good thinkers? Maybe not necessarily, because often people are so preoccupied with the objectives of their profession that
Hmm.
one can lose sight of a larger picture. And not to
Hmm.
say that everybody who does a PhD needs to be an academic. Like perhaps uh, they may not be good at or may not enjoy teaching or doing research
Hmm.
anymore after that PhD. Right? So that doesn't mean that those skills and those processes of learning one has acquired uh, are not
Hmm.
meaningful elsewhere. So having that
Hmm.
awareness
Hmm.
can help, especially in today's time
Hmm.
when the academic jobs are like few and far between. So then, if
Hmm.
you need to reinvent yourself, it's good to be aware of how you'd like to do that, like which way you'd like to go
Hmm.
with that. So yeah, these are all
Got it.
possibilities.
You said that like the PhD process, changes you as a person. I'm curious to know for you when you look back before you started the PhD and yourself now, what changed in you through that PhD process?
Well, yeah, that's a difficult question probably to answer. But I think the way I think about the world has changed fundamentally, and I think that's somewhere I cannot go back. You know, now,
Give me an example.
right? So when somebody says like any event or any piece of news, let's say, right? Now, when I was younger, I would be inclined to just believe whatever that comes my way,
Hmm.
right? Uh, and it's a kind of a small example, right? Like, but this you can apply this to different kinds of situations, right? The way I process information, and maybe it's a process of growing up. I don't know if it's like that for everyone, but I do see that there is a
Hmm.
difference in which having a sort of academic training enables people
Hmm.
to process information differently. So we are,
Hmm.
if you want an analogy, we are data analysts, but not like of numerical data or data that's just been sitting like on a database. It's just like your
Hmm.
way of perceiving the world changes. So everything I see and hear um, goes through a different kind of filter. Sometimes that can be
Hmm.
useful. Sometimes it can be actually a source of confusion. Like in the sense that you would want that. Okay, how do I explain that? Like, now I think of this issue, XYZ issue in a particular way, and maybe
Hmm.
I can take a simpler life decision had I known lesser,
Hmm.
right? So like I could be on
Hmm.
autopilot and decide to do this kind of a job, let's say, right? Like
Hmm.
now having more awareness of what that job would entail, not only as the job itself, but what that industry means, what kind of impact it has on social. So let's say if I were to be a banker who
Yeah.
get a lot of flack for sort of as a example, stereotypical example of this, and not
Yeah.
to say that all bankers are bad or whatever, but the idea that if you went into something knowing what you're getting into, and that's okay
Yeah.
for you, yeah, you get this out of it, and you know that these are the costs, personal costs as well as social costs of doing that.
Hmm.
Everything has that, right? So I think that in these kind of situations, there are better tools for making those decisions, as in there's more information and more options to work with. But on the other hand, that
Hmm.
can be a source of confusion because then you have to think more
Hmm.
about everything
Yeah.
before you get into it. Whereas sometimes knowing less and just kind of following a path that has been laid out
Hmm.
can just be easier and more financially rewarding as well, probably, at least if you're in banking.
Is there a decision right now that like you're paralyzed at because you know too much?
I would say, yeah, I would say no too much. Actually, that would be a little bit more hubristic, and I think I should have framed this better. I think I'm just like looking for words to sort of describe a sensibility. I won't say that it's more knowing, it's more knowledge necessarily. It's just that you are
Hmm.
tuned you end up being tuned in a different way, especially if you are in certain
Hmm.
disciplines, right? Which are more closer to social critique. Uh, Anthropology
Hmm.
is one of them. History also does
Hmm.
that or enables you to do that. And that's why it's something that everybody should learn in school or wherever. A little bit of
Hmm.
exposure, no matter what you are studying or what you are training in.
Hmm.
This sort of social science or even humanities training is important because it just helps you to uh, understand society and processes differently. Like, I'm comparing, let's
Hmm.
say, to students who are studying engineering, and they have a very, there's a kind of a track, right? When you follow
Yeah.
engineering, especially in India, that pressure is always there, engineering or medicine and so on. Now, when you're doing that, it's completely fine to pursue that. But at the same time, one can also do that in a way which broadens a set of tools which help you to understand what is happening around you more better, right?
Hmm.
Like the social
But is
issues.
that good? Is that net good? Like, don't you feel that knowing too much is like, man, like now I've become an overthinker. Like I can see pros and cons on everything. So as a result, I'm like, yeah, maybe sometimes it's good because you don't take things at face value, you don't believe people blindly, you think for yourself. But at the same time, like you just do not make any progress because you're always looking at, like, you can always see the clear downsides of certain things, and as a result you just do not make progress.
Mm.
You're just constantly thinking and evaluating. Do you feel that?
I don't think that necessarily happens. It can happen for certain
No.
things, right? Like, so certain life decisions,
Hmm.
maybe, right? But like, especially if you're in academia, like, the kind of choices are stark. So then
Yeah.
uh, you know, uh, you have to make peace with doing something that you know that inherently you may not like, right? Like, so if you enjoy doing research and you have the luxury of doing that, then to do
Yeah.
like a desk job is going to be incredibly hard, right? Because you have been
Yeah.
used to a certain kind of independence and sort of freedom of thought and all of that, right? But I don't think at a
Hmm.
general level it's a
Hmm.
problem because I think that's what we need. A lot of problems
Hmm.
that any country today faces. If you look around the world, there's this switch towards extreme right kind of
Hmm.
and that's yes, one can have different positions, but
Hmm.
overall, it's clear that it's not going doing good to the world, right? Right, right. If you look
Hmm.
around, and there are dangerous discourses floating around everywhere. So I
Hmm.
think that
Hmm.
this sort of training helps you to have a little bit of a critical filter. It doesn't mean that it goes on
Hmm.
overdrive all the time, right? But I think that
Hmm.
people are just better placed to make better decisions, better voting choices,
Hmm.
better, even social choices, or even in their own work, even in a small sort of radius, they're able to enact
Hmm.
uh, and do things differently. And I think it's a sensibility rather
Hmm.
than knowing more. It's not that
Yeah.
no academic or nobody knows everything or more or less, right?
Hmm.
It's a question of how much awareness you have, and when a certain issue is important, if you have that
Hmm.
curiosity and that temperament to question things,
Hmm.
it only helps you to get deeper into that, and you can make a better choice
Yeah.
about that. Uh, Ultimately, when
Yeah.
you make a choice, anyway, you're going to make a choice, right? So it's a
Yeah.
question of whether it's going to be an informed choice or something you just kind of
Hmm.
walked into without knowing, and you have to realize,
Yeah.
once you're in it.
Yeah. Oh well, well, we took a little bit of a tangent, but that was what you felt changed for you during the PhD. You now look at the world with a different lens, and I agree. I think I have not studied, as much or as many years as you have, but I do feel like going through Stephens and going through sort of the liberal arts, ecosystem and environment does make you sort of really question a lot of things, and that questioning sort of makes you, yeah, I think that it is good. I think there are a few things which, for example, I would say I have very, unique views or like contrarian views, and like I have very high conviction in those views because of this questioning. But I will say that for me personally, I find myself at spots wherein I'm just like, I wish I could think less about this stuff. Like I wish I could just like go with the herd, and then, net the outcome is not too bad. um or maybe, sometimes you end up at the same outcome, but you didn't have to think so much and go through so much of, I don't know, um yeah, like decision making process. But I guess like maybe the pros outweigh the cons. um
Yeah,
yeah, I don't
and
know.
also like using, we all have a brain, and using more of it, yes, it can be tiring, but it's not a bad thing
Yeah.
necessarily. It's training certain
Hmm.
muscles, if you think about it,
Yeah.
like just at the sort of the biological level. But on the other hand,
Yeah.
it's not, this necessarily doesn't come only through what you learn in the classroom. Actually, anything, most of the things I've learned, if anything, has not been in any classroom, right? It's been outside of it.
Hmm.
And I think that's where,
Hmm.
when we are pushed outside of our comfort zone, when
Hmm.
you are, and we have had the privilege of being sort of traveling or having lived abroad.
Yeah.
But even if you move from one city to another or one town to the next one, when you come out of your comfort zone, you are just forced to learn and process information differently. And I think that's generally a
Yeah.
healthy process. That's a good way to educate oneself. Um, Whatever
Hmm.
that leads to, that doesn't matter. But I think that,
Yeah.
as a process, that's very, very helpful. And I think, as you said about conviction, uh, yeah, I would think that it's good to be not to be not be too convinced about anything, right? There's always
Hmm.
room. There should always be a little bit of room for error or to change your views, because I think that's the dangerous part.
Hmm.
Now I realize
Hmm.
that as I'm getting into, like, sort of a particular kind of career track where you expect to check
Hmm.
boxes, you're expected to have a narrower vision of life and
Hmm.
everything. I'm realizing that there's a danger for me to have this hubris about my convictions, right? So I have to be
Hmm.
careful about that as well. Like, in the sense that, okay, now I know all this because I've been doing all this,
Hmm.
and I can easily
Hmm.
settle on a position permanently, whereas the world around me is
Yeah.
changing. Like, 5 years from now,
Hmm.
researchers working on the same topic will have different ideas than I did. So I also
Hmm.
have to be able to adapt to that possibility and not be too convinced about something.
Hmm.
In light of new
Yeah.
information, I can change my opinion, and I think that's a healthy attitude to have,
Correct.
probably. At least. I don't know if it's helpful, but
I've heard this. I've heard this phrase. You should have strong beliefs, but loosely held.
you're right.
So if you believe something, you should believe strongly, but then you should not hold on to it. Like you said, if you get more information.
Yeah, that's a great
Okay,
perspective.
let's talk about something else. You moved to Geneva back in 2011. You've been in Geneva and now sort of in the Netherlands, broadly Europe for a while. Um, what do you like the most about living in Geneva, and what do you like the least?
So I think Geneva is a very interesting city because it's very unique. I haven't seen a place like that. Like, a lot of places will claim to be international, and they may be international in some way, uh,
Hmm.
but Geneva is very differently international from anything else. So it's a much smaller city, first of all, than compared to London or New
Hmm.
York or whatever your reference for this international is.
Yeah.
Uh, but it's also a very layered city. So that's on the downside, that it's not a city where you will find everything on the surface, right? But if you look deeper and you know what you're looking
Hmm.
for, you will find that for sure. And it's a city from which the
What does that mean? Give me an
yeah.
example.
So you come to Geneva. You could be interested in the international sector, international development, UN.
Yeah.
You want to be a diamond trader. You want to be an arms trader. Everything is possible in Geneva, right? So the whole
Okay.
spectrum, and I think that it's very unique in that sense because it's everything happens behind doors, right? So you have this big UN building and all whatnot, and one would give you the impression that that's where the world is being ruled from or whatever. But that's not the case. It's just a bureaucracy. The actual ruling of the world happens in these little backroom meetings and so on, right? So whenever there's a war going on somewhere
Hmm.
else, people are meeting somewhere secretly in Geneva to decide the fate of that country.
Hmm.
Uh, and a lot of legal and illegal art trade goes through Geneva, for example. A lot of both licit and illicit museum collections, all of these things. Apparently, there are these containers outside the city where they keep all this art and stuff, and then they release them occasionally when it's good time for the value. So these are kind of
Yeah.
things that, if you spend long enough, you begin to realize about the city. And I accidentally ended up putting this part in the good. Well, I'm not going to make a big distinction between the good and bad. Like, you can choose for
Hmm.
yourself.
It's a fine
Yeah,
line.
and that's exactly the kind of place it is that you can really determine in a way your own, what you want, which bubble you want to be in, and you can be completely isolated
Mm.
from everything else. That's also incredible that you can occupy certain layers
Mm.
and not have any interaction or visibility with other layers. So it's not ghettoed like many other big cities are. Spatially, it's
Mm.
not ghetto, but on the other hand, it's very layered somehow. So I think it's a very
Mm.
fascinating place because of that. And it's also a place where
Mm.
I've met people from everywhere in the world, like countries and places I didn't even know existed. This is the kind
Mm.
of place where you often might end up meeting people from all over the world. So I think that had a very
Mm.
unique flavor in terms of just giving you a
Mm.
sense of what is global, right? Like or what is the
Mm.
world kind of concerned with, and it's very different from other big international cities. So yeah,
Mm. Was there anything you did not like about your time in Geneva?
I think that it can be very isolating because of it's a smaller city. People are always transient, at least in my circles, right? So if you're part
Mm.
of an international circuit, a lot of people are transient essentially. So I think that
Yeah.
transience makes for a little bit difficulty in maintaining friendships and keeping sort of a community around you. So I think that was harder
Mm.
to do there. And on the other hand, being small, it also helps because you have everything that a big city has in a small space, very well
Mm.
maintained, very good
Mm.
infrastructure. One of the best airport commutes in the world. Like it takes only 7 minutes. It used to take me like a total of 15 minutes from my door to the airport, right? Uh,
Mm.
I mean, depends where you live, but yeah, so it can be like that.
Yeah.
And despite being a small airport, it's pretty much connected to the whole world. Right? So I think those are the kind of
Mm.
advantages one can have living in a place like that.
Mm. Interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your PhD. You've been broadly studying. So you started off doing international history at your master's, and then you told me in your voice note that you started to train in anthropology, and you started making that shift. Um, I know I've asked somebody this question before, but I do want to know from you, how would you describe anthropology? I know a lot of people who studied history with us in college go on to study anthropology, and I know somebody on this podcast has given me an answer, which was pretty convincing. But like, what is anthropology? What do you study as a part of anthropology? You've been at it for a few years now, and you've done history. So like, what is anthropology? How is it different from history?
Yeah, that's a that's a question. Well, that's going to be part of my lectures probably next semester, which I haven't yet figured out. So I think you've given me
Great.
some.
You can find the teaser
Yeah,
here.
you've given me some homework to do necessarily. Although these what is anthropology lectures are, I think, at least 3 hours each. So if you don't want to be here that
Hmm.
long, nor do I have that much knowledge about it to describe it in that time. But I think
Hmm.
that as a discipline, it has a particular history, right? It has a problematic history,
Hmm.
and because of that,
Hmm.
because it started off as a colonial sort of, as a colonial discipline that helped colonial rule, very simply put. How you go.
Because the colonists wanted to understand how the people functioned, so they studied them so that they could rule them better. That's the history of
That's the
anthropology.
argument
Is that
that they
correct?
make. But actually,
Okay.
as anthropology evolved, yes, it started off something like that, right? Not all anthropologists were doing
Mm.
it that way, but largely, it was about understanding other systems of other people, how they live, all of that.
Got it.
But invariably, what ended
Mm.
up happening a lot more than not was the fact that anthropology also became a way to create a certain form of knowledge where you could basically prove that certain people were inferior, they were savage, they were primitive, they were
Mm.
violent, and these kind of ideas, right?
Oh.
But they were largely linked to economic concerns. So when this kind of an explanation is given, it's primarily to say that, oh, there we have rubber plantations here, but the people living around are savages. They are attacking us, and they are disrupting the rubber production. So because they're savages, we want to request the
Mm.
army to come in and kill them or pacify them so that they won't do
Mm.
this
Mm.
anymore. So it became implicit or complicit in this kind of project, and still continues to be actually,
Mm.
unfortunately, to some extent, like in the
Mm.
politics of development, but not as a discipline anymore as much. But this kind of discourse and rhetoric continues to in modern day development, for example, is one area where you really see this. And
Mm.
that's where anthropology as a discipline today is helpful. Because by studying anthropology, you really understand these kind of dynamics about the world, right? So you're able to connect.
Mm.
You're able to connect why being a banker in New York can be a bad thing for somebody else in a country in Africa, for example. Because
Mm.
you are able to study how a certain policy being taken in the UN or in international financial sector or wherever has
Mm.
effects on people elsewhere. So that's another example of how
Mm.
anthropology today can be a useful discipline to study social systems
Mm.
of where we live. But aside from that, it also, because of its own history as a discipline which was very problematic, anthropologists
Mm.
tried to evolve a very self-critical discourse about itself. So it's one of the disciplines that has
Mm.
most amount of critical learning about the discipline itself. You see what I mean?
What does
So,
that
for
mean?
example, if you are studying,
Anthropologists love to shit on themselves on how shit anthropology is. Is that in
it,
essence?
it can be sometimes, yes, but but
Okay.
it's just the recognition of the fact that as a it's one of the more reflexive disciplines, meaning that there is a lot more self-awareness about that history, even guilt, to a point where it's
Mm.
actually sometimes not useful. But there is that
Mm.
as reckoning with its own history, which has forced the discipline to be more critical in of itself, but also the
Mm.
how it studies society, social
Mm.
phenomena, right? Which is different
Mm.
from, let's say, how a political scientist might look at it. For political scientists, a lot of things are
Mm.
given, taken for granted,
Mm.
and they're very reductive, right? So, and maybe
Mm.
for a certain kind of theory, that some level of reduction is necessary, but it doesn't really grapple
Mm.
with social realities, which can be more subtle.
Mm.
So anthropologists
Mm.
still largely work with smaller sets of communities, and I'm not saying that this is all how it's done today, but you can have multi-sided
Mm.
ethnography and things like that. But one of the things that anthropologists do
Mm.
is that they are situated in the context, but what they're studying, as a
Mm.
sort of a participant observer.
Mm.
And broadly speaking, there are different
Mm.
aspects of it within what is called ethnography. And I think that's what distinguishes it as a discipline and method from, let's say, a historian. Because a
Mm.
historian primarily is concerned with, at least from a disciplinary point of view, looking at archival sources, which can be written archives,
Mm.
it can be oral archives, etc. Whereas an anthropologist lives
Mm.
often, more often than not, lives among the people and communities they're working with.
Mm.
And this can be in an international
Mm.
organization. There, of course, you don't live with them, but you go and spend time with them. Uh, it can be in
Yeah.
a industry. It can be in any sector, basically. So it's no longer going to some
Mm.
remote tribe and studying what they do.
Yeah.
Um, Although that is still done in India, actually, from what I understand, and that kind of comes under physical geography these days. So, I mean, that's a very kind of
Mm.
colonial racial science which has
Mm.
continued to remain in some spheres of the world. But yeah,
Got
anthropology
it.
largely um, deals with all these other
So
things.
it's mostly like understanding the people, like one like prerequisite. So in essence, what you're saying is it's basically understanding people in communities and societies. But an important preface is that you actually live or you're like in that environment versus like say a historian who would just look at like material and like need not like live
Right.
or like be part of that thing that's
Right, and
studied.
I wouldn't say live.
Hmm.
I mean,
And,
sorry, just to clarify this, right? Like I gave a very reductive sort of explanation, and
hmm.
one that was more methodological, right? Like, so it was a question of how do
Hmm.
people understand what they're studying, and what is the technique they're
Hmm.
using. It's not necessarily live that you
Hmm.
do spend time. It can be
Spend
spend
time.
time at length or
Got it.
whatever. But that's not really the I mean, that's the disciplinary method, but the takeaway
Hmm.
is not that, right? The takeaway is to understand
Hmm.
social phenomena by looking at, let's
Hmm.
say, smaller components of societies. You can be concerned with a specific location, specific society, or a
Hmm.
specific institution you're doing anthropology of.
Hmm.
But from that, one tries to connect it to larger issues in the world and larger theories. So it's not
Hmm.
only about what is
Hmm.
XYZ doing here, why is
Hmm.
that relevant? How is it connected to larger
Hmm.
processes, or what does it tell us about how how we think about society? I think that is the
Yeah.
more important part.
Okay. Understood. Got it. Okay. So let's talk now that we have a sense of history, anthropology. Let's talk a little bit about the stuff you were working on. So you did your PhD. I don't know the specifics, so maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But in the broader theme of food and the Northeast, for people who know Kakati back in college, you would know that he was quite the foodie. Not only he was very good at cooking it, but he also, I remember you and Baker would go over these expeditions to find new places. I was fortunate to be part of one of them. We went to this kick-ass place in Chandni Chowk and had some kick-ass chicken, which was basically bathing in butter. But what was your PhD in? And we can later talk about why you decided to stop doing that and switch over to something absolutely different, which is war. But what were you trying to do with food Northeast? Maybe give me a like a and try to explain it to a 5 year old. How would you describe to a 5 year old what were you
Okay.
working on?
Well, so the food project actually started off as my during my master's thesis, right? And that's
Hmm.
something that my supervisor encouraged me to do because I was writing generally about
Hmm.
food history stuff. So he saw that I was interested in that, and I wanted to go and do something
Yeah.
else, which is coming from the Northeast. I wanted to write something on conflict, which is what usually a lot of writing about Northeast used to be about at that point of time, especially.
Yeah.
And there were these particular conflicts going on, so I wanted to work on the media representation of that and so on. My supervisor told me, like, look, you're more
Hmm.
interested in this food thing. Why don't you just do that? So, like, I scrapped everything I
Yeah.
was doing and I went to my field site in Assam, and then I also did a little bit of field work in other cities like Delhi and so on. And these were building on my own
Hmm.
experiences of this pursuit of food. So in the end,
This is while you were still in your masters. This is not you've not started
yes,
your
this
PhD
was
yet.
during my master's thesis,
Okay.
and I
Okay.
started to work on this phenomena of as I was growing up in
Hmm.
Guwahati, basically pork was something taboo even for caste Hindu communities largely around me in school and so on. So
Hmm.
but by the
Hmm.
time I was doing this in 2010, 11, or 2012 ish, pork had become so popular, very mainstream
Hmm.
across Northeast. It's in Assam,
Yeah.
it wasn't a thing, right? And even in Delhi, if you
Hmm.
remember when we were there, if you wanted to eat pork, you would
Yeah.
have to go, out of the way a little bit, like either to a Chinese
Yeah.
restaurant or you'd have to find some small Northeast restaurant somewhere, which was not as easy to do those days. And now it's a completely different story, right? In a place like Delhi.
Yeah.
So basically, I started to look at how that happened, like how a certain with
Hmm.
migrations, which resulted, by the way, from ceasefires that happened in the late 1990s in Northeast. A lot of people started to move
Hmm.
to places like Delhi, right? Like migrants and people started to open restaurants. So the main story really was about how did pork particularly, but not only,
Hmm.
how did an ethnic cuisine come up in India, basically?
Hmm.
And today in India, ethnic cuisine
Hmm.
is usually connected to Northeast cuisine. So nobody goes and says, "I'm going
Yeah.
to eat Udupi food." Nobody says it's ethnic cuisine from South India, right? Or when you're
Yeah.
going to eat Punjabi food, nobody says it's an ethnic cuisine, which is the way which in
Hmm.
outside of India, like in the US and so on, that there used to be a time when food from international food was defined as ethnic food. But in India, ethnic food meant
Hmm.
primarily northeastern food, and that was a kind of branding that people did on their own. So I was
Hmm.
just interested in mapping that phenomena out and trying to understand
Hmm.
how people's notions of taste, but also what is taboo, otherwise, like certain kind of meat, beef,
mm,
pork, etc. How did they become acceptable?
mm, mm. And then your big conclusion was that because there was like ceasefire and what ensued in people migrating outside the Northeast, that was one of the big reasons why. Because you're right. I think when I think of myself growing up, yeah, we didn't eat too much of pork. But I don't know if that was like a Faridabad thing or it's just like, yeah, like we never just bought it because, it was like Haryana. I don't think anybody eats pork in Haryana. But Goa, like we used to eat a lot of pork. Like Goa, there's a lot of pork there. Have sausages and things like that. But you're right, when we came to college and now maybe when we go back to Delhi, it's like much more like you see it on the menu, like double fried pork and things like that. Um, so basically, you're saying because there was ceasefire, because people started moving out, it resulted in like this cuisine sort of spreading through the rest of the country and now becoming pretty, I wouldn't say mainstream, but much more popular than
Right.
like five to
Yeah.
10 years
Well,
ago.
it's mainstream enough in the sense that people know what it is. Like when you say, but I
Yeah,
think the issue is deeper. So the fact that the migration happens and this phenomena happened was already the template into which I entered, right? That was already happening, and people had
yeah,
been working around. A few people, scholars had been kind of looking at this migration phenomena,
mm,
but and what it meant economically, like broadly in the retail sector, a lot of people who moved worked
yeah,
in beauty parlors, restaurants, places like that. But the whole
yeah,
underlying issues of prejudice, racial discrimination, racial stereotyping, what is a smelly food, when
mm,
you cook bamboo shoot,
mm,
there's a lot of policing around that. So these are kind of issues that actually emerge
mm,
by looking at this. So on one hand you have the mainstreaming
mm,
issue, right, or story, which is about a broadening
mm,
of taste. Uh, People became more familiar with these things, and it became more popularly available on one hand. But on the other
mm,
hand, there was also what is it running against, right? Like, why is that important? Why is that familiarity important? And
mm,
what kind of frictions does it cause
mm,
as well? So these were more important or bigger
mm,
social issues that came out from that point.
mm.
So yeah, that you can
Got
look
it.
at racial uh, profiling and discrimination through that. So I've written a bit on this. I also have a podcast on this issue of racial
Mm,
prejudice and how particularly meat plays a role in that, right? And we still have that going on even today, right? Like even
mm,
recently, for different reasons and in different contexts, one kind of meat particularly usually appears because it's the most, let's say, volatile thing to spark
yeah.
off this kind of a problem. And it's not only in India, it's also globally
Mm,
you've had discourses of inferiority and superiority
yeah.
based on that, like who eats what, right? And whose right is it to
Yeah.
say who can eat what or not? And I think these are also bigger social issues
Mm,
that I think we can talk about. And I touch upon this in some of the
mm,
publications and in this podcast as well.
mm. Well, if you're interested, you can find. I will leave links in show notes. So if you want to interest, if this piques your curiosity, you can always find uh, the podcast and Kakari's essays in the show notes. Um, you did this theme for a few years, and then you switched over to study or to pursue your curiosity in war and conflict. My bigger question is, how do you decide a topic? Like when you're doing this PhD or when you're doing this whole academic pursuit, how do you decide what you want to do? Because like everything seems interesting, everything seems like, oh, this sounds cool. How do you sort of decide and commit? Because I mean, a PhD is a pretty serious thing, right? You can't just like by a whim and tomorrow I feel like studying some pork and food and tomorrow I'm going to study like war. How did you go through that process to decide what it is you're going to sort of, research and study on?
So I did it whimsically, basically, and that's not the way to do it. Probably that's not a good way to do it. Let's say, right? Like what you just described is exactly what I did, probably in the end. But yeah, usually people tend to have like if you've worked, especially if you've worked somewhere, or you've had like certain issues that have come up again and again that you come across. That's when people
Hmm.
really decide that okay, I'm going to do this kind of research project, right? So often you'll find somebody who's
Hmm.
worked in a development or NGO sector, and they've been working in a particular area, and
Hmm.
then they got interested in a particular issue through that. So then
Hmm.
they come in and do a PhD on that topic later, right? So that's one way of
Hmm.
doing it. Mine was the complete opposite
Mm.
and idiosyncratic, I think, to some extent, but of course not fully. I
Mm.
mean, in the sense that
Mm.
this interest in food, the curiosity that food invokes in me, both internally as a personal
Mm.
interest, but also as a way to understand society, right? Like I think that
Mm.
growing up, even in college, having access to or not having access to, having friends who have been discriminated, or and what all of that, all of those
Mm.
experiences are part of that, right? Like so, when one goes
Mm.
around looking for, when you're reading and when you're exploring ideas and so on, then you find uh, organically you kind of evolve sort of the research. So in my case, at least, it was like that. That
Mm.
I didn't go with a clear question. Often, good way to do research is to have that and then do it. In my case, I
Mm.
just followed a lot what was going on, what was available to me, what was I coming across. Of course, with some ideas in my head already of,
Mm.
what I might be looking for, and
Mm.
that helped me. So I started off just
Mm.
pursuing food as an identity marker, right? Positive and
Mm.
negative. What
Mm.
does having certain kind of food or having attachment to certain kind of food or practicing certain food,
Mm.
sort of norms, what does it do to somebody's identity,
Mm.
especially when you're away from your social context? So if you're a migrant from Nagaland or Assam,
Yeah.
invariably my project ended up focusing a lot more on Nagas because they were the first and the most
Mm.
established entrepreneurs in this sector in big cities. Not to say that other cuisines were not coming up.
In the sector, you mean
Yeah,
like food sector, like the restaurant
business, yeah.
business.
And
Mm.
and even in Assam, which Nagaland was a part of historically and is a neighbor, like you
Mm-hmm.
could have very small places where you could eat. But when I was in high school, there was this place called Naga Kitchen run by. Now it has many branches
Mm.
across different cities in India, but this was run in a
Mm.
person's small, like kind of not even basement, like a small, yeah, area in his house. It started off with three tables, and
Mm.
now he has like multiple restaurants, right? And this Naga entrepreneur called
Mm.
Romeo Seth, who's half Punjabi, like half Sikh and half Naga, kind of brought the
Wow.
best of sort of this Naga food in a big way, in even in a city like Guwahati, where it was very kind of
Mm.
not accessible to the common Assamese
Yeah.
person, and not interesting even to a lot of people. So
Mm.
I think that
Yeah.
uh, these kind of things that you was around me helped me to build on that
Mm.
question. Whereas,
Mm.
yeah, there's the
Okay.
other way you could do it. And I think you wanted to know about
Mm.
the transition from that as well, or right?
Yes. So, talk to me about how you'd move from food as a broad theme to conflict and war. And maybe talk to me a little bit more. What stuff are you working on more
Okay.
recently?
Um, so as I was doing so I started doing the PhD following up on the master's project. I wanted to do a broader version of that.
Yeah.
Largely speaking, I was interested in the question that is there something that are there some things that Northeasterners as a whole or as distinct communities can or want to use as their identity marker in contemporary history. So it was more of
Hmm.
a contemporary history
Hmm.
project, and that's why I had to learn a lot more anthropology theories, techniques, and so on, because it was not something I
Hmm.
could do sitting in an archive. I had to be out there and do it.
Hmm. Sorry, if I can pause you, what do you exactly mean when you say contemporary
So
history?
some
What does
Right.
contemporary
So
mean?
something which is closer to our time, right? Like, so I'm looking at a decade ago. Like
Okay, got it. So, like last 100 years?
100 years wouldn't be very contemporary,
No?
at least for me personally, in my
Last
scale.
50?
Yeah, you could say I'm looking at like a decade or a couple of decades of change, right?
Okay.
Uh,
Wow. That means Reuben's podcast is a contemporary
it
history
is,
piece of
yes.
work. A work of
Yes, it
contemporary
has been around
history.
for a decade now, right? Like, so
Okay, sorry.
it will fall within that.
I mean, we explore lives over a decade. So, man, I should start calling this podcast
Yeah,
contemporary
I think that,
history.
it could become an archive actually, right? Like if you once you have enough of these down the line, who knows? Maybe you
Yeah.
could have a repository in St. Stephen's, basically. Like you could have people go and
Well, maybe.
um, listen
Maybe.
to these oral histories of people's lives.
Okay, sorry, I cut you off. So you were studying what northeastern people from the northeast of India would like to use or would consider using as a marker
Right.
of
Because
identity.
something, yeah,
That was the question you were
something
trying to
was
answer.
happening, right? Like in the 2000s, and we grew up in that time. So I was growing up in Assam. So I was wary of the fact that something was changing, right? That when I was younger, we were still in
Hmm.
this kind of post-insurgency sort of situation, even in an urban
Hmm.
city, although we don't obviously feel it as much. But there were things like, we didn't celebrate Republic Day
Yeah.
like you did in Delhi, for example, or you or whoever else did in Delhi.
Really?
Because for us, when I came to Delhi, I realized, oh, people are flying kites, Independence Day, etc. Like, it's a different kind of occasion. Whereas for us, it was something we used to watch the parade on TV in our homes, but we would not go to certain parts of the
Hmm.
city because we knew that there was symbolically a lot of these outfits who were against the Indian government and state would
Hmm.
basically plant a bomb or something like that. Certain areas would be targeted. So, there was always a curfew.
Hmm.
We grew up with curfews a lot. We
Yes.
used to play cricket. We didn't care. Like, those days we were, oh, it's a holiday, okay, play cricket, But I
Yeah.
realized that, yeah, curfew is not a normal way of life, right? But in Guwahati, we grew up
Yeah.
like that. And it was even worse in places like Imphal and elsewhere, right? Like other cities of Northeast where the intensity and pool of conflict was a lot more. So from that context, things were changing a bit because a lot more ceasefires had been signed, a lot more groups had been either negotiated, and sort of there was a change in the capitalism scenario, like very like crudely put. So you could see that these kind of changes were happening.
Hmm.
In the context of those changes, I wanted to understand what does it mean to be a Northeasterner in India today, right? And given the kind of issues that were coming up with
Hmm.
racism, with discrimination and with violence that people face, we have seen that ourselves with
Hmm.
our friends, and so these kinds of
Yeah.
things, basically, this public identity is what I was trying to understand, and what are the ways in which one can express that, and how can I study that? As I was looking for these kinds of things, food was one of them, of
Hmm.
course, but not the only one. There were other things like festivals,
Yeah.
for example. Another arena which was being
Hmm.
changed around this time was tourism, because in 2011, a lot of parts of the Northeast, which were formerly banned to people from outside, the rest of India and abroad, had been opened up. So now you could visit Nagaland as a tourist,
Hmm.
right? So then suddenly there was a new tourism
Hmm.
infrastructure coming up, and partly top down, also ground up. So in that context,
Hmm.
accidentally, actually, I came across something when I was attending this wedding of our friend Bom Kipkin, his
Hmm.
sister's wedding in Imphal. I was staying in this hotel, and I came across a brochure about Second World War tour, battlefield tour, right? So I was like, wow, this is something new.
Second World War
Yes,
battlefield tour
in
in
Imphal,
Manipur,
yes, around Imphal, hmm
in Imphal.
in Manipur, yeah.
Okay.
And I was interested, like, I didn't know much about the war at all. This is not something we learn in school or in college, right?
Yeah.
And
We just learned the start here and the end here, and that's it. And there were
yeah,
Axis
yeah.
and
No, the
Allies.
fact that the war was happening in India, and to the scale at which it happened, this is something I found out later. But and and also around that time,
Oh, I'm just
yeah.
learning this right now.
So there you go.
World War Two was fought in
Yes,
India.
it was
Some part of
actually
it.
it's in the UK. The National Army Museum of UK in 2013, I believe, voted
Hmm.
this battle in Imphal and Kohima to be the greatest battle in British history, over Waterloo, over all. Yeah,
What?
they voted it, like, So this is what propelled
What
this
the fuck?
whole event into limelight because of this voting, and then suddenly it became very, sort of important in the public discourse. Of course, a lot of people in Britain and the Anglophone world in general denied that. Like, they're like, what do you mean? Like, how is that possible?
Hmm.
But I guess their argument being that this is the first place where Japan lost. Before the Japan had not lost, and they were in
Oh.
Burma. Those days, Myanmar was called Burma. So they
Hmm.
occupied most parts of Burma, and then they invaded India through Imphal and Kohima. Right? These were points at which they tried
Oh.
to invade India. And had they succeeded, I think a large part of India or all of it could have fallen to Japanese as well, like Singapore and other places did. So
Hmm.
before this, what was happening is that you had this
Mm-hmm.
wave,
Mm-hmm.
Singapore, Southeast Asia, like Japan had just conquered everything, right? So the British Allied
Yes.
forces had collapsed. It's only in this battle that they managed to turn the tide around and get their act together. So that from
Oh.
that point of view, I think
Wow.
so the National Army Museum probably that's one of the reasoning why they consider this to be the greatest battle in British history. Would have turned out very differently.
Hmm.
Now the fact that it's like that,
Wow.
and or at least it's main publicly held to be like that, and also held suddenly
Yeah.
meant that a lot more people were interested both in India but also abroad
Yeah.
to come here, right? So this battlefield tour, I kind of started investigating, and eventually I went for it as well, and became friends with the people doing this group of entrepreneurs, basically,
Hmm.
and also writers. So you know, one of them, the main person who had set this up, Hemant, who's
Hmm.
a kind of maverick, really. He's worked in Geneva, works in Delhi, but he was doing this in Manipur for a few years. And I was interested from the
Hmm.
point of view of what this means for an identity, question again, right? Like, is the Second World War a
Hmm.
way for people in Manipur or in Nagaland to claim a global identity, being part of something that was beyond not only
Hmm.
their local area, but beyond India, beyond, like, it's part of a
Yeah.
global history, right? Like, of the Second World War.
Yeah. It's like the Battle of Normandy. Like everybody in the world knows what happened on
Exactly, right?
Normandy because of that, whatever the
Exactly.
invasion.
So, So yeah, because of that limelight it received, I think it came into prominence, and gave people an opportunity to also think of an identity beyond that. So I also have a short article on this as well, which I can post.
Hmm.
Uh, Basically, what it does for the memory politics of this war, right, and how it becomes relevant
Hmm.
again in today's time. What does it say about
Hmm.
a so-called kind of remote place like Imphal, which most people
Hmm.
have not been to, right, or have no reason to think that they want to go
Hmm.
there, suddenly is an important place in the
Hmm.
world. Right? People from all over the world are coming there.
Hmm.
Japanese,
Why do you think nobody talked about this? Like I did not know this, but seems to me it's a pretty big event. Like why do you think that eventually
right?
happened?
So I think some historians who have been working on this issue, and I also agree with them largely, is that one of the reasons for erasing this whole story is because it's actually something that was not very comfortable both for the British as well as the Indian Indian political setup at that point of time, because the war happened very close to
Hmm.
independence, right? So the
Hmm.
war happened, the Japanese invasion happened in 1944, and they lost very
Hmm.
quickly. By end of that year, they were already, like, losing, and then the British and Allies went into Burma and then Southeast Asia after that. So, but
Hmm.
1947 is when India becomes independent. So somehow
Hmm.
this was kind of an uncomfortable memory for both, right? Like the British could have lost easily, and for them they managed to win the war. So the larger story of the war was more important for them, especially the victory in Europe, because the sort of the
Hmm.
home, the UPA, and the
Yeah.
British nationalism emerged as a result of that war. Right?
Hmm.
So beating the Germans, things like that. So basically, they
Hmm.
were more preoccupied with that. And as far as Indian
Hmm.
nationalists were concerned, I mean, they weren't really. For them also, it's an uncomfortable memory because partly they supported the British, partly they did not. Like there was
Hmm.
some agitation, so they didn't have a very clear, role in that. Although a lot of Indians
Hmm.
participated and made the British victory possible, but I think their role in that
Yeah.
was not very clear and not very glamorous, right? So, and also it was not their war, right?
Got
Like,
it.
so what benefit can
Yeah.
uh, the nationalists of that time claim from having won a war
Yeah.
against the rulers that they're trying to get, or in with rulers that they're
Yeah.
trying to get rid of? So I think that because of that,
Yeah.
its relevance as a political event uh, for Indian history seemed to be less, and that's why
Hmm.
it got erased from everything.
Hmm. Interesting. For people who are interested with this kind of stuff, and just for fun, it is worth seeing how far west Japan did conquer during World War II. It is pretty crazy. They had half of China under them. Um, yeah, I did not know this for a long time. And then, as you know, I've lived here for a few years now, and as you see how much of an influence or how far Japan did conquer Asia is pretty crazy. So it's not surprising that they reached
Yeah.
Burma and India. Fun fact.
Yeah, I was explaining the topic, right, of the Second World War. But I think why
Mm,
that topic was interesting for me eventually and why I pursued that was
mm,
because I realized that one, as you pointed out, as we realized that there's a big omission, big gap in that history, right? But
mm,
of late, there have been books and people
mm,
working on that topic, India's role in the war in India, war in the
mm,
Northeast. There are books about that.
mm,
But for
mm,
me, the fundamental
mm,
question really that emerged from that research was actually we can understand why the Northeast is the way it was when I was growing up, a so-called conflict zone,
mm,
is primarily because of the Second World
mm,
War. And that connection is something that we,
mm,
did not really understand. And why is the Northeast governed in a particular way since that time
mm,
became clearer because of that, because of the
mm,
militarization that happened
mm,
in that region. And that's also what enabled a lot of these groups that emerged after, during the independence and after independence era, asking for different kinds of self-determination
mm,
claims. And that is very deeply connected
mm,
to the Second World War. So I think that's where it's more relevant as well from today's point of view.
mm. So explain that again. You're saying that because it was like this hotbed, or it was like the forefront of the battle, it as a result became a highly militarized zone, um, with a mix of, I would assume, mix of forces,
That
um, and then that sort of explains why the Northeast, the 50 years later, continued to stay quote unquote a militarized zone. There was conflict. There were a lot of groups fighting among each other, and only in the late, like early 2000s, did, as you said, things started becoming quote unquote different, or like uh, less of like curfews and
Right.
stuff like that.
But also to understand why that happened, right? Like, and how. Because I think the important thing is that militarization happened, yes. But why would people start
Yeah,
taking up arms for no reason, even if it was militarized? And I think that's an important question to ask.
yeah.
One thing that happened was that because a lot of the local communities, especially in the areas where the war happened, like in Nagaland and Manipur,
Mm,
uh, particularly in Nagaland, a lot of people were trained in using arms and modern arms. A lot of people participated with
mm,
the British allies, also sometimes Japanese, but largely with the British allied forces, especially when they were winning the war. The support for them increased. So a
mm,
lot more people got the training, guerrilla warfare training. In fact, a certain kind of jungle guerrilla warfare was
mm,
almost invented in Northeast India and Myanmar, actually in Burma warfare, which became part of Cold War doctrines of warfare, which I've discovered while I was doing this research. So it was a very important place for certain types of warfare to be developed, and also, modern techniques of war learned a lot of guerrilla techniques from Nagas and like sort of traditional warfare techniques came in very handy
mm,
to modern warfare to be able to fight in this kind of terrain,
mm,
mountains with jungles and and so on. Now, what happens after the war is that the people living in these areas got used to a lot of capital, like sort of globalized forms of capital and contact, essentially. But after the war,
mm,
both the British government and then Indian government after independence tried to make this a remote place again. And I think both intellectually, but
mm,
also like physically, politically, it became marginal again, right? And so people now
mm,
who had certain kind of demands, certain kind of political aspirations, were asking for those things, and they were not given that, right? So it was not that people
mm,
took up arms for no reason, and there was coercion involved, right? Like from the Indian state as well,
mm, mm,
um, and both ways. So violence became a way to leverage with each other, in a way. And
mm,
because people were already trained and access to arms was there, it became easy
Hmm.
for a guerrilla movement, or it became possible for a guerrilla movement to emerge. And this is more so the case in Myanmar or in Burma, because there the complete polity was destroyed, right? So the militarization
Hmm.
and the armed conflict there has a much more serious and much more clear and obvious route. Whereas in India, it was not necessarily the case. It
Hmm.
could not have been like that, but it did end up being like that. And a lot of
Hmm.
laws, like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which is notoriously known for
Hmm.
being deployed in India, uh, origins of that is also in the Second World War. It becomes this law later in the 50s, late 50s, but these kinds of
Hmm.
ways of governance essentially became possible,
Hmm.
and a kind of trajectory, if you like, during this period and
Hmm.
because of this war. So I think that's a nuance I have to add, I
Hmm.
think, to sort of make this distinction, that it was not just about
Hmm.
the global history of the Second World War in Northeast, but it has serious meaning
Hmm.
for how how history after that has, or how life after that has meant. And of course, it's not to say that it's only because of the
Hmm.
war. After that, it took its own life
Hmm.
and own kind of self-replicating model, right? Like it became attractive
Hmm.
for people who were dispossessed in the Northeast largely. The relationship with India was extraction, right? So you had lesser
Hmm.
infrastructure, but you also had lesser all
Hmm.
kinds of goods that come from being governed. Like rest of India was governed differently,
Hmm.
and this place was treated differently, right? So taking up arms became a
Hmm.
way to leverage with the state.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
yeah, so I think that is at the root of the
Hmm.
kind of politics that we saw for a long time uh, in this till this period.
Hmm.
And the and
Nice. Well, if you want to read more about this, I will make sure to put in a bunch of Kakadi's works on the topic, and you can find all of that in the show notes. Um, Going back to my question, what are you looking
so
forward to over the next
Right.
six
So
to
I
to
have
12 months?
finished postdocs after two postdocs after this PhD, and the postdoc also kind of pursued this question. I mentioned this word remote, so I looked at what happens after the war. How does this place actually become remote after a global war, right? And what kind of consequences does it have
Hmm.
in different sectors? So
Hmm.
there's one intellectual way of making a place remote. There's a physical way of making a place remote.
Hmm.
So that's what I looked at. Um, and the basis of that research, I have both the PhD research and what I've been doing after. I have a lot of writing that I've been doing and still have to do. So in the
Hmm.
next 6 to 12 months, I think a lot of my time will be occupied with doing that, trying to get all of this out
Hmm.
there. But aside from that, I will be teaching in from September for a short period, like a semester. I'll be teaching in a
Hmm.
place called Groningen, which is in a city in the north of
Hmm.
Netherlands. And I'll be teaching in the Faculty of Religion, Culture, and Society very broadly. But most of the things I'll be teaching will be to do with anthropology or perspectives from anthropology
Hmm.
in these yeah, covering a broad range of issues
Hmm.
basically. And after that, I hope that if I enjoy doing that process, first of all. So I also want to find out. I have taught a bit
Hmm.
before, but in a very different kind of context. This will be undergraduate teaching. So imagine going back to like our classrooms
Hmm.
and what the teacher standing in front of like 60 of us was going through. Yeah,
Good luck.
and now I actually feel bad like for not having been a better student probably because I feel that karma can come back.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, hopefully it will be a good experience, and it will also tell me, I think,
Hmm.
if I enjoy doing this or not, if I'm able to do this or not,
Yeah.
and yeah. So I'm hoping that I will get some clarity. I can't say something should be going back to what we started off with. Just because I am an academic doesn't mean that this is
Yeah.
what I will be good at or will enjoy doing. So hopefully
Yeah.
I can have clarity on that. And after that, I
Hmm.
will seek, for some time at least, I will seek academic oriented jobs. or fellowships that allow me to do writing,
Mm.
basically. Because I do feel that all the work I've
Mm.
done, all the research I've done, I have a lot of materials, and I think there are some important points I
Mm.
can make for for better or worse.
Mm.
And if that comes
Mm.
out in productive ways that can be useful for public debate,
Mm.
engagement, or general
Mm.
understanding of these issues, I will feel that yes, I've done justice to all of that. And after that, whatever
Mm.
else I do, it doesn't matter then, right? But I would feel
Mm.
that if I had to switch my career before I at least came out with some of those things, then yeah, I would be less happier about it, I think.
Mm. Actually, on that one, I have a maybe related, slightly unrelated question. Like, what is the source of motivation for people who are in academia? Or like what drives somebody who's doing some work like you, like a PhD or teaching? Is it just the intellectual curiosity that I have to understand this topic? Is it I have to contribute to this body of work? Is it I want to be famous and I want to be known for uncovering this? Like, what do you think drives people in your space? You interact with a lot of people in, doing PhDs in universities in
Mhm.
academia. Like, what drives you to do all of this?
Yeah, I think people have all kinds of motivation, and drive is the most important thing to sustain yourself in this sector. Many people I know, many of my colleagues are no longer academic, precisely because of the stakes involved.
Hmm.
You really have to purely love reading and writing and doing research, which many people do. I also do, but I think that if I'm in a situation where I have to re-examine this, I'm prepared to do it. And my main motivation has been, till now at least, has been mobility, right? Which is something I mentioned before. But when I say
Hmm.
mobility, it's not just because I get to go and live somewhere else or something like that, right? Other careers might also give you
Hmm.
that. The kind of
Yeah.
intellectual mobility I had, I think the freedom to pursue what I like, what I want to learn about, and
Hmm.
how I want to learn about the world. I think that's something that has sustained me for a long time. Now that I find myself increasingly cornered in the sense that I have to adhere to the checklist of the industries and disciplines, right? It makes it less interesting sometimes. I do feel frustrated that I have this very broad
Hmm.
interdisciplinary training, which
Yeah.
is actually sometimes not good for me because if I apply for a job and my CV
Yeah.
reads like it's all over the place, like a very conventional historian
Yeah.
reads my CV, they're not able to see the historian that they're looking for there, right?
Yeah.
Like if they have a certain idea of what
Yeah.
that historian should be doing and how. So I think that
Yeah.
does cost me a little bit. So I think that from the industry point of
Hmm.
view, I'm not very conformist, right? Like so that
Hmm. But what has changed? Is it because you're now like trying to look for a job? Is that the big change? That you move from like like studying and pursuing postdocs to now, hey, I gotta find a job, like a teaching job or like a research job, and that requires you to sort of fit in a box versus as long as you're studying, you can
yes,
just do whatever
I
you
think
feel
yes.
like.
The short answer would be that, but of course
Hmm.
it's a little bit more complicated. Uh, See, teaching is fine
Yeah.
because despite being a historian, I've got this, but also the same problem, right? Like broadly speaking, why should a history department hire me if I look like an anthropologist, or vice versa? In this case, I'm lucky
Yes.
that because it's a faculty, the teaching where I will be doing, it's a faculty which is interdisciplinary in nature. They were welcoming. In fact, they
Hmm.
preferred my background because they thought I could bring something extra or outside of the box for students,
Yeah.
right? And for teaching purposes, it can be very helpful, useful, or at least more clear.
Hmm.
I think till a sum of more publications are out, I it's harder for people. That's why I have to focus on the publications now because I think for me to be legible in certain
Yeah.
ways, and I've had to re-strategize, right? So I have had to now re-strategize a little
Hmm.
bit in terms of how I do the publications, which publications will deal with which discipline,
Hmm.
for example, what kind of audience. So I've had to
Yeah.
segment them more and more. But yeah, what you said, like largely
Yeah.
speaking, if I have to fit into something, I have to fit in a particular way, and I think that is a bit more
Hmm.
difficult, and that problem becomes real when you start
Yeah.
to look for a job, right? Like till the time you have the freedom to do
Correct.
what you want to do and how you want to do it, it's completely fine. And I think that research is really about that,
Yeah.
right? Like good research and good
Yeah.
thinking, at least how I benefited from it. I'm not saying that that's,
Yeah.
but I felt that the experience of being able to do it that way is what sustained me, because that made it interesting, it made it exciting, it made it yeah, something worth
Hmm.
pursuing. Whereas once those things are
Hmm.
taken out, I have to look for what is in this
Hmm.
industry, and what I like about this industry, and what are the things that I can take forward with me when I do something else. Uh, Things
Yeah.
I still like, ideally.
Hmm. Correct. Interesting. Okay. As we enter the tail end, Kakari, as you look back over the last 10, 12, 13 years from when you were in college to where you are now, um, what is one shift in belief you've had? And by shift in belief, I mean something you would believe very strongly, say, as a 20-year-old, and now you've taken like a 180-degree shift in
Hmm.
that belief.
I think, well, there are probably a lot of things, so I have to think more deeply about this actually. It is a very profound question, by the way. Because
Mm-hmm. Ruben's
yeah,
podcast is not fun and
I can
jokes, yeah.
see.
I'm kidding. It's
Yeah, now
contemporary
that it is,
history.
I think you need to be asked. You are asking these kind of questions and forcing uh, people to think more on those lines. I think that yes, somewhere, uh, I can't quite say how, but definitely my political convictions about how society has been and could be like better. Those kinds of things have changed a lot. And unfortunately for me, what has
Hmm.
happened is that I find myself, because I've been out away for so long, but I'm also still quite kind of rooted in some ways, right? I feel that I am
Hmm.
um, often at odds, right? Like, and I think many people might feel that, but like there are many things I've taken that is great from the context I've come from, and there are many things that are great from other contexts. So now I have the freedom to kind of pick and choose things
Hmm.
from whatever suits me. Whereas
Hmm.
if I'm in India, for example, you see that there's a lot more source of frustration because that's not how things will work.
Yeah.
Or equally, one can say that if I'm in Netherlands, for instance, there are a lot of things that also don't fit. Um, so basically, I realized that
Hmm.
yeah, like my convictions may not have completely flipped everywhere, but I realized that yeah, somewhere they needed to be more flexible, but some other places they have become harder to accept, basically. So a lot of social norms
Hmm.
I would have been okay with.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, so I was
Oh, like do you have an example which explains that
yeah. I
better?
mean, I have to again think about that, but like I have uh, yeah.
I mean, don't worry if it's something you want to be cleaned out later.
Yeah,
We
you
can
might
of
have to
course
remove
do
one of
that.
these little gaps. But yeah, no,
So speak.
no, it's something. It's a very nice question, so I want to think about it and not like give a kind of very trivialized answer. But
You can take your time.
I can try and identify some social norm later. But let's say uh, any social norm about yeah how personally, like where I should be at a certain age. Like that's how everybody thinks like that, right?
Hmm.
Now for me to
Yeah.
take my time, whether it's career, whether it's like personal things, like whether you want to get married or not, these kinds of issues, these I think I
Hmm.
would have been more inclined to follow convention, like when I was 20, right?
Hmm.
Because well I didn't know much at that point
Hmm.
of time, and you go with what everybody's
Hmm.
doing or what is the norm around you. Now
Yeah.
that I have had the choice of not having to follow that, but also understanding the pros and cons of this process and also my own limitations, right? Like I have to
Yeah.
understand that some things are not practically possible because I am, I still have to look
Yeah.
for if I have to be in a permanent academic job, what kind of academic job do I want? Do I want to be in the tenure for race for tenure, which is to the US? but it's incredibly stressful. Would I take any like a less glamorous job, which is more easier to keep, more stable, permanent, let's say?
Mm.
And yeah, so these kind of questions are there, right? Like, so I'm a bit more aware of it, and I've had to also choose priorities accordingly, right? So instead of prioritizing convention,
Mm.
prioritizing what I would have believed to be the right thing to do, I now have to constantly examine what is the
Mm.
right thing to do, and try and figure out and try and do that,
Mm.
right? Like, so I think that's a big shift in how
Mm.
one operates, or at least how I operate.
Can you pinpoint like the time or like a series of events which resulted in the shift?
I don't think there is any particular incident or particular sort of set of events that does this. I think it's just the fact of having being displaced a lot. I think what is important here for me is that the fact that I didn't spend a lot of time in one place at a go, and it can be
Mm.
very unsettling, right? And it is unsettling. And I also realized that that
Mm.
unsettling nature has a purpose. So on one hand, and it comes at a cost, of course. You can't then have the markers of like a kind of a good life or whatever, however you see it. Um,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, I understood the value of that. It helped me to stay grounded to a large extent, like stay a bit alert, both mentally and intellectually in a way. Because, for example, had I lived in Geneva for a long time and only lived in Geneva, I would have become much more
Mm.
Europeanized, right? Which is fine, but I would have also become
Mm.
much more used to the kind of luxuries that life would have afforded. And I am used to that luxury to some extent,
Mm.
but not it.
Mm.
It could have made me it could have been in a way where I would have become very complacent, intellectually, socially, and
Mm.
so on. I would have lost a little bit more touch with let's say where I'm rooted to, um, and I think
Mm.
that having this back and forth, which I did during the time I did my research, I used to travel a lot to India, different parts of Northeast, different countries. Like I
Mm.
would go to the UK, US. I spent time in these places. I lived in also for shorter periods in different places. So this helped me. The
Mm.
constant need to adapt helped me, I think, to stay a bit more alert, like not get complacent.
Mm.
And at times, when I
Mm.
could choose in Geneva to have a much more cushy job, which I had while doing the PhD, I could
Mm.
have sort of used that, for if I was thinking more instrumentally, I could have used that in a different way. But I chose to disrupt all of that. I moved to
Mm.
the US, which was a nice opportunity. Of course, it was.
Mm.
I spent a year in Princeton, and then I realized how provincial Princeton is. Right? It's Princeton is one of the sort
Mm.
of most well-known universities in the world, but it's one of the most provincial places I found coming from Geneva. Right. So
Mm.
these kinds of things basically gave a different awareness about the world. Now, it made my life harder, as we discussed earlier. Like when you kind of
Mm.
have too many thoughts about something, it makes it more complicated, right? So,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, I think it helped me to understand, okay, or think more deeply, if not understand, that what are the things I should value or I value actually. What is important to me?
Mm.
So yeah.
Mm. And what is the
So
answer
if
to that?
I think that I would choose. Um, I would think, for example, in the example that I gave you, right? Like I would think about the place I'm at, living at, but not just the university and the allure of the job, let's say, right? Because if it was the allure of the job, then I should have tried to look for jobs in the US. It's another issue that it's going to be very difficult to get a job in the US because their own job market is
Yeah.
very saturated and it's also very monopolistic. Um, but even hypothetically, if I were to get a job, do I even want to move there? Because I realize that what do I value? I don't value having to work crazy. I do work a lot, but I don't believe that that's the way to live, right? One should enjoy the work they're doing. One should
Mm.
work hard, yes, but it doesn't mean that you need to be in this kind of rat race. As long as I'm doing a job where I can do
Yeah.
what I want to do or what is the valuable part of my work, like the research, let's say writing, teaching, etc., I don't need that, right? Also, as a society,
Yeah.
like, as a place where you feel safe to live and this sort of thing. I realized after living there that that's not a country that I actually particularly enjoyed living in. I mean, of course, I had a nice time when I was there, but I have,
Hmm.
yeah, the way in which it operates, I find it less attractive. Right. So if you were to think of it
Hmm.
from a very like sort of, oh yeah, oh, I got a job in Ivy League in the US,
Hmm.
I would still think twice about taking it. I don't think most other people would,
Hmm.
or maybe they might, but I'm just
Yeah.
thinking of it differently. And it's not just the job that is alluring me.
Yeah.
I want to have a bigger picture of what that life will look like. And
Hmm.
yeah, so I think that that's how I'm
Hmm.
like quality of life is important to me. Like having time for your
Hmm.
hobbies, having time for family, having time to do what you like to do, having time to travel, having time to go
Hmm.
home. These are things that are important to me. So yeah, I would like something
Hmm.
that gives me that rather than I don't know, like more fame, more money.
Hmm. Okay. Well, explains why bankers are bad people, or why you believe
Or
that.
they're more successful anyway. I mean,
Okay. Last
from
question.
the normative way. Yeah, monetary and
Monetary
mhm.
lens. From the monetary lens. Yeah. Okay. Last question for you before we wrap up. I mean, you get to ask me one question, but my last question to you is: what are two pieces of advice you would have for 19-year-old Aditya?
Oh, I think yeah, a lot of advice probably. Start to do well. It's okay to not comply, but I think I need to comply more. Yeah, listen to what I've been told to do. I think um,
Hmm.
I don't know if that resulted in success or not, but I think that yeah, if I follow convention
Hmm.
because I realize that I'm part of the system and I can make changes in that
Hmm.
system by being part of it, right? Like I can't do it from the outside. Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's where it goes back to the SUS thing, actually, in a way. And sometimes
Hmm.
it's a good time for me to refer to actually, because you asked me if that has any relevance from today. Because I try to think of it as, how did I think at that point of time? How I tried to do things first of all a little
Hmm.
bit beyond myself. It was not just my own interest. So if I think a little bit beyond just myself immediately, I think that decisions look
Hmm.
different. But at the same time,
Hmm.
I think some conformity is required so that you can enter the system on those terms, even though you want to be different in it, or you are
Hmm.
different in it. It's not because I want to be, it's just that I'm not always in line. So finding a
Hmm.
better meeting point uh, is one piece of advice, conforming a little bit more.
Hmm.
And then the other piece of advice, I guess, is that, yeah, like, think back to times where it helped you to me to think in a certain way, and perhaps if that allows me to make better decisions now, I can probably do that. And your podcast has helped me to realize this. Actually, your questions did that.
Hmm. Sorry, I didn't understand your second piece
So
of advice.
basically, yeah, like when you ask me about my experience in college and how that helps today, I think that
Yeah.
that itself can be like a piece of advice would be that look back to times when you had
Hmm.
yeah, greater insight, and how did you manage that? Like, it was a challenging time, but
Yeah.
what helped you to overcome those challenges?
Yeah.
What was the kind of thought process? Perhaps that can be
Yeah.
helpful again in times like now when there's a transition
Yeah.
period and you need to I need to
Yeah.
make certain decisions. Perhaps a time like
Yeah.
that can help me reflect on how to make those decisions.
Hmm. Got it. Okay. So conform a little more and look back in the past um, to help you with decisions today. That's a good piece of advice. Okay, as we wrap up, after all the questions I've asked you, Kakari, you get to ask me one question.
Okay.
What do you have for
Well,
me?
you've been doing this contemporary history podcast. Uh, I'm sure that
I love it. I'm going to call this a
Yeah.
contemporary history
Uh,
podcast now.
you're building an archive, which is I think interesting and important.
Yeah.
Also because of institutional history, all kinds of history, right? Um, so
Yeah.
I have two-part question. One is that like you have been you have been questioning a lot of people, but how about how do we get you to be part of your own podcast? Would be one, because I'm sure a lot of people would
Mm.
like to know about you, and I think you've been following a certain trajectory of your own and following other people, asking them to be on the podcast. So I think you need to do like a meta podcast of your
Mm.
podcast at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. Episode 100. Episode 100 might be somebody
Yeah.
interviewing Reuben, but that's TBD. We
Yeah,
got to get
so
to
that would
episode
be, well,
100.
that's more of a comment. And the second, I guess I have to ask you a question, like of, you know, you've already told me why you do this podcast, but is there any, like,
Yeah.
throughout doing this, is there like one or two big lessons that you've learned from speaking to everyone that you have so far? Or like a takeaway?
Mm, I guess one big takeaway um, I've had from this podcast is actually two big ones. I think I've said this before, but these are top ones which come top to mind. Um, One is how everybody, where they are today was not part of the plan. It was almost like we just landed up here. But yet people are quite, um, yeah, quite happy, quite satisfied with where they are. Um, I won't say I feel that this is the end destination for most people on this podcast. Like it's still like transit, but there is this weird sense that you've landed up here, which was not part of the plan. You're quite, you're quite content. You never knew that you will land up here, and when you look back, maybe 20-year-old version of yourself is quite, is quite proud, or is like, wow, you actually landed up there. But yet you're in this transit wherein you're trying to figure out what to do next and trying to plan for what's next. And yeah, it's like a weird irony wherein you landed
Right.
up here without a plan, but you're trying to plan. So that's, I think, one takeaway I would say take. And I'm equally part of that. Like I'm here, not part of the plan. Checks off a lot of things that I wanted to do. Actually, I must say that I will come back to that in a second. Let me write that down. Um, but yet everybody's trying to plan what to do next, so that's one. The second, I think, I would say, which is a big takeaway, is how people now sort of view things beyond their work, much more important. I think when we were in college, even maybe 3 4 5 years after that, it was very very centered around the work we do. Now I think everybody across the board, while I think work is an important pillar of people's lives, I think they also care a lot about other stuff. So much so that you know on a previous episode I told somebody that it seems like everybody is just some of their ambition and drive has just died. But I think they corrected me and said that no, it's not that maybe ambition died, it's just that other things are much more important now, so they're still ambitious, but they care about other things, which I think rightly so. So yeah, I think those are probably two big
Great.
big takeaways. But the thing I wanted to tell you, which I just remembered, one of the things, like say 20 or 19-year-old Ruben wanted to do was to sort of live abroad and like go abroad. And I, like, growing up, I was always fascinated with like airports. Like I would love to go to airports. um and just seeing these aeroplanes take off, you're like, wow, like they take off from here and they're going to land in some other part of a world, like this new place. And the closest to wanting that, I think, was this time wherein actually we had all come to drop you at the airport. You were actually packing your bags and going to Geneva, I think. And I remember thinking to myself, man, look at this. He's packed his life and he's going to go to this new land and he's going to live in this new country. Like, forget visit, like, he's going to live there. Like, oh my God, I want that. And at that point, it was just like, fucking go do a master's or write these fucking college essays. And I'm like, I'm clearly not qualified to do any of that. I'm not the smartest in my class. Forget these scholarships. I'm never going to get them. And of course, that's not the path I went down. But now, for many years later, and I sometimes I take a pause and I think that, oh my god, like I am actually living abroad, which was like crazy. Right now, I take flights in and out of India, which is like whatever. It doesn't feel that crazy, but yeah, that's a fun fact. I vividly remember you were packed up your cart, you were going through, I think it was Terminal 3, and I was like, man, like just imagine on the cab ride back. I think we were going back to Bomb's house or something. And we're like, my God, like I want to do that one day. Just pack my bags and book a one-way ticket to go abroad, and then just not have
Oh,
to come back.
oh.
So
Well, thanks for
yeah,
sharing that. Thanks
a
for
random
sharing
piece
that.
of
I mean, I
trivia.
didn't have probably have the same thought process. Like, I also didn't, but you're right. Like, I think there is something to do with this sense of manifestation, if you, for lack of a better term. I didn't particularly think about living
Yeah.
abroad, but a lot of things I was interested in, again, like with food and so on, right? Like, I grew up with these cookbooks of my grandmother and so on,
Mm,
where you had all these things that we never got to
yeah.
eat in India, right? Like, you don't have those. So one of the first things I did
Yeah.
when I moved to Geneva was actually I was so excited about the supermarket. I still am excited about supermarkets even here. In fact, I
Mm,
will go to the market
mm,
now. There's a nice Saturday market that is in Leiden, in the city I am in.
mm,
Um, so that was really my first, more than anything else. As I came to Geneva, with all the things you mentioned, like there could have been all of these things that should have attracted me, but it didn't. Like I didn't care about the UN, I didn't care about my courses. I
yeah.
mean, I did, of course, went there, but really, I found
Yeah.
myself most excited about just going to the supermarket and just exploring these things I saw in the cookbook. And I guess yeah, that 20-year-old
Mm,
version of ourselves it's a threshold where you are
mm,
uh, at threshold of a new possibility, and your curiosity. The world is your oyster, as they say at
yeah.
that point of time. And by now, as you were saying,
Yep.
most of us have realized
Yep.
that yes, people have one way or another pursued something of that sort, but now you are in a place where
Yeah.
you think of, yeah, contentment differently and curiosity differently, ambition looks different. And I think that, yeah, very nice
Yeah.
framing you did, and also nice takeaway to have from this podcast.
Yeah. 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 That, I think, if you could summarize all like whatever 70 conversations and then there's probably like a common thread which goes through, which is I think very interesting. And I think it's very interesting for a 20-year-old to hear that. Uh,
So we'll wait for episode 100
yeah.
then, when you'll
Anyway,
have the.
we'll wait for episode 100. Oh my God, that's going to be an exciting one. But let's see. Maybe it's episode 1,000. I don't know. Uh, okay, with that, I think we shall wrap up. Kakari, if people want to get in touch or keep up with all the cool stuff you're doing, whether it be your academic work, your research, your writing, how should
So
people find you?
for my academic work, I can send you a link. I sometimes post them on academia, for example, or Twitter is another place. I'm not
Hmm.
very active there, but work related stuff I tend to
Hmm.
post there a little bit. For not non-work related stuff, which is
Okay.
mostly to do with food, you'll find me on Instagram. So
Hmm.
either way, it's fine. I
Hmm.
rather, yeah, I think Instagram is nicer because then I engage more as a person rather than professional. So yeah,
Hmm.
but if you just want to interact
Okay.
with the professional, then you can reach me on email. I don't know, Twitter, whatnot.
Well, you can decide how you like to engage with Kakati. I would, of course, recommend the Instagram path, but you will find all the links and handles in the show notes. Whether you're watching this on YouTube, you can find it in the description, or if you're listening to this on your podcast player, you can find it in the show notes. Okay, with that, I think we shall wrap this conversation. If you've enjoyed the episode, please go and leave me a review or a rating. 5 stars, the only one you're allowed to leave. And if you enjoy this, consider dropping Kakari a line. I think he'll be happy to hear from you. And maybe one thing you enjoyed from the episode, let us both know. We'll be back with new episodes, hopefully in 2 weeks. And until then, Kakari, thank you very much for making the time on this rather early morning for you in Leiden. It's been a blast. I hope you
I
enjoyed
did. Thank you so
your
much,
time
Reuben.
on the
It's
podcast.
something we've been wanting to do for a while, and I'm so glad that we got
A
around to
while.
doing it. And, yeah, great conversation.
Yeah, finally. Okay, we shall go off the record and